Now, let me move on to leadership years. This is 1996 to 2004 when I was appointed the chief planner. I was appointed chief planner of the old city of Toronto in 96, and then 98, of course, amalgamation, courtesy of Premier Harris, happened. Notwithstanding, 76% of the people voted no in a referendum. It happened. So you got to deal with what the cards are. And the thing I learned about leadership is this sort of message: the opportunity for change. Now, this picture was taken actually after I retired, but it's symbolic. And the context of this picture was the entire front page of the Sunday Star. Is the editor asked me after I retired to write a big piece for the Star about what if Toronto could be blank. And they ran a series, and people wrote in hundreds of emails. And so I did that and pulled that together. And that's what the message was of the citizens. You know, we want more change. We want positive things to happen, not negative. And I have a definition I shared yesterday. I'll take it. I'll share it with you now about leadership, which is something else I learned in that job. Leadership: taking people to a place they would otherwise not go, which is the real definition of leadership. And sort of I found that first with the King story, where my staff opposed me, and I said, no, I got to do this. I got to lead this. This is the right thing to do. By the way, getting pushed by Jane Jacobs had a powerful influence. But nevertheless, I really stuck with that, and people did follow me, and I was proven that it was a good move. 3 guiding beliefs attached to this, and I touched on them yesterday as a leader, director, chief planner, whatever it is, if you have that opportunity. If ideally you can go into that job at the stage of your life cycle that you're not afraid to be fired. That's the first thing, which is a tough thing to swallow. But you got to be honest with yourself. Could you sustain that? Why is that important? Because if you really are serious and you want to put forward great planning ideas and get things done, sometimes that happens, as we all know. The second is to establish a strong relationship with the media. Absolutely critical. Don't ignore them, embrace them, and develop an ongoing relationship. I did that with all Toronto Globe, Post, columnists, TV, CBC Radio, Metro Morning, all that kind of stuff. I deliberately was very public because I believe that was honestly part of the job as a chief planner. And the third was this business of the publicness. I deliberately decided that I would get fired or retired from the job when I got it. And so I was going to be a very public chief planner. And that got me into some hot water at times. I remember once, I'll tell you this little story. Mel Lastman was the mayor. And he set up, I was doing the official plan, and he set up this meeting with Ryerson James, who was a Toronto Star columnist on urban affairs. And we had just come out with the new official plan for the amalgamated city. And the mayor loved it. He was one of my biggest supporters. And anyway, so we had this meeting in the mayor's office, and Ryerson started writing down comments. So the mayor starts talking, and after about 5 minutes, he was finished. So he looks at me, he says, well, he says, you talk, you tell him more, right? So I said, okay. So I go on for quite a while. And Ryerson got a great story. The next day, the front page of the Toronto Star, headlines, you know, new official plan released. The story's all about me. The mayor was on page 7. Needless to say, I heard about it. But you know what? I didn't feel bad about it. I didn't do anything wrong. I did exactly what he told me to do. But I'm sure you know this. Politicians crave attention and soothing and publicity. Let's be honest. It's politics, right? So interesting lesson there. Here's what I inherited. This was part of amalgamation, which was 6 former cities plus Metro, all thrown into one, with different wards, 44 wards. There were 57 at the time of amalgamation. District service boundaries, that each department had different boundaries. A mess. Unbelievable. So I had to make sense of all this stuff, which was obviously quite a challenge to keep me up at nights. That book I referred to yesterday, only I put it in there because it was the last book she ever wrote. Good one for you to read if you haven't. And she sort of was a pretty good fortune teller. And in that book talked about some real tough times ahead that have unfortunately kind of come to pass in the last 10 years or so. And we have these big challenges ahead that we all know about. So it's useful to take a look at. Here's one of the lessons that I put together after my first year. And this is sort of how things happen. The analogy was the amalgamation. How do you move forward through real tough times? So the bad place was amalgamation. 76% of people didn't want it. A lot of anger, fighting, denial, tons of meetings, you name it. It gets passed by the provincial legislature, notwithstanding all this. Then you're in transition, which I call the worst place, because everything feels bad, there's lots of confusion, nothing's easy, you don't want to let go of the past, and you don't know where the future is. And so in that transition phase, a lot of the planners that I inherited from these 7 former departments, well, we had the right way to do it in North York. And then Scarborough would say, oh, no, that's bullshit. We do it our way. And Toronto would say this, and Etobicoke this, et cetera. Well, I decided none of the above. So I developed one new plan with a brand new approach that I'll tell you about quickly. But my message here is you have to get through that worst place as fast as possible. Because if you get stuck there, it's like glue, crazy glue. You're dead. You never get to the better place. And that's the lesson I learned out of that. Everybody wants to go to the promised land. Okay, so here's the structure I put together as chief planner in trying to make sense of, all these different 7 departments and competing egos and ideas. I won't walk you through it. It's just a very simple thing of 4 area, community, and neighborhood kind of local groups with a director under each, and then a citywide director of policy and research, a director of urban design and infrastructure, and a director of transportation planning. I fought big time to get transportation planning in city planning, not to be in the works department. And that's where it is. And I think that's very important. I have nothing, I got along fine with the works people. That's not the issue. It was because it's planning. It's not doing or building or measuring road widths, et cetera. It's the planning part. So that was the sort of structure that I started off with, and all these other things you can see relate underneath each of these boxes. But it served me pretty well, and by and large, that's the structure today with some modifications. Here's what we did with that official plan story. And the reality is that those are the official plans I inherited on the left-hand side. They weighed 31 pounds. And so what I did when I went to the city council to ask for authority to develop one new citywide plan for the amalgamated city, I got a box and I brought it to the podium at city council. I took out weigh scales from the public health department. And then I put the box up here and I took, as I was making my speech, I put down North York, 8 pounds. Then I put Etobicoke, 6 pounds. Scarborough, so and so and so. And it grew before the eyes of the mayor and council. It was about this high. You could hardly lift it. I said, members of council, Mr. Mayor, this is why we need a new official plan. You can't even lift it, never mind read it. Unanimous approval. It was a very simple presentation, but the importance of using props, stuff you can see, feel, touch, got me through all this. So we did this 3-year consultation process, very intense, 180 public meetings over the 3 years, and it proved very successful. We came out with a directions report, which we called Shaping Our Future after the first year and a half. Then we went out for more public meetings, tested this out, and then made some final modifications to the final plan. It was the toughest thing I ever did in my planning career, but it was very fulfilling because it has resulted in city building beyond my wildest expectations. This is the structure map, not the land use map, the structure map that we put together. So you can understand the city in simplistic terms. Big place geographically, it was 2.4 million at amalgamation. Today it's 2.75 and growing like mad. Very simple strategy. I called it yesterday the 3 lenses of planning. The yellow and the green, hands off, stable residential neighborhoods, just minor changes allowed. In the orangey color, the downtown core and the main streets, or the orangey color in the downtown core and the waterfront, and the red, the North York Center, Scarborough, Etobicoke, Young Eglinton, yeah, channel the growth into there deliberately. And I actually channeled 75% of all the growth of the city into those 5 areas, sorry. And the third lens was the main streets, the arterial roads, those linear brown colors, where you can actually encourage incremental change, sometimes more than others, generally the mid-rise stuff, from 5 to 10 stories, depending on context. That's the structure plan. Media, I told you about. I work with the media a lot. Got tons of good press, good attention, columnists, lead editorials, met with the editorial boards. It's part of the job of a chief planner. If you want to get this stuff done, you got to do all this stuff. So never regret doing that. Just, never mind all the details here, but just sort of location of all the residential units, what's happening. What's interesting under that, you'd expect a lot of towers downtown, but you see the avenues, well, there's a pretty good chunk of 30+% of all new development going on the avenues, which is, it's now starting to take off. It was very, very slow for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about. And you can see the non-residential in the bottom. So basically about 80% of all the development that's happened since the plan was adopted in 2002 is going in the right place where we wanted it to go, which is pretty good. Here's an example on the avenues looking north. This is sort of from Yonge and Bloor area, straight up Yonge Street and right up Avenue Road. And you can, obviously, you've seen these, I think, before, but you can chart the 3 lenses here, the stable residential in the green, the avenues, the mid-rise, and of course the subway stations, Yonge and Bloor, and Yonge St. Clair, Yonge Davisville, Yonge Eglinton. You can see the relationship, very, very strong. So I'm pretty happy with that. We're experiencing enormous growth. This is under construction in between to an off-ramp in the Gardner Expressway, a 70-plus story condo tower, a very thin sliver that is now under construction. All of this work I did was very rewarding for me, but it was really doubly rewarding when I went to London, England. I told the story yesterday. In 2000, the chief planners of Canada, we got together, we did a tour of London. And I took the Toronto plan over because they were just doing a London plan. This was Mayor Ken Livingston. And the long and short of it is they found our plan and the approach to it to be very inspiring, and they use it as the basis for the draft London plan. And this I treasure from the Deputy Mayor of London, Nikki Gavron, who wrote to me, basically gave me her autographed copy of the London plan and said, thank you for all your inspiration, et cetera. So something that I feel extra proud of. Here's the thing about scale, which is very important. Scale comparison. These are the Portlands in Toronto. And there's about 1,600 acres, as you can see. And most people don't, it's kind of a empty sort of industrial area. There's an entertainment district, there's the old Hearn generating station. But if you superimpose that same area, as you can see on the downtown core, you could fit the entire downtown into 1,600 acres. I mean, and this is important for thinking about land consumption. You know, you can do an awful lot through intensification and compact city development in a fairly small geographic area. And that scale comparison, I think, was quite useful. In terms of the waterfront, I talked about this yesterday. I'll just give you a couple of brief comments on it. This was called a principles plan for the central waterfront. No land use, no heights, no densities, just principles. Principles and core actions that would follow up and big moves that would relate to it. It was designed to buy political support for sure, but also to stand the test of time. So the idea was to have these principles that were so valid today, they'd be just as valid 50 years from now. And I told the story about Chicago yesterday. I'll do it briefly for those of you who weren't there. Chicago's waterfront is quite distinct, big park swath, Millennium Park, etc. That was the result, of course, of the Burnham Plan, but also one core principle that Chicago and all its mayors and business people have followed for over 100 years, and that was that the Chicago waterfront shall remain forever public, period. That's the planning philosophy, and they stuck to that. Now, when I had the debate with my city council, I said, you guys can't stick to principles more than 3 years. You know, we got to do this. This is important, right? And you know what? In the Mel Lastman Council, it was adopted unanimously, unheard of in the Toronto Council. Nothing happens unanimously. So the use of principles is often a good way to get through barriers in tough times when you tend to get bogged down in detail. So from those principles, we then develop precinct plans. You can see here in these different areas. A lot of this stuff is underway now. We move forward with these kinds of layers, I'll call them, of, okay, what's from the principles to the precinct plans, the neighborhood character, what are the development guidelines, but most important, starting off with the public framework. That's where we put all the emphasis first, on the public realm. The private came after. And that's an important lesson, because if you just do the public first and forget about the public realm, if you just do the private first, often you can't fix it. And so this is an important lesson here. Those are the application of all those principles and layers and thinking in the West Don Lands. That big park now exists. Next time you go to Toronto, it's called Corktown Common. That's where the Pan Am Games are going to be held. All that's built. It is something that is going to be really quite a handsome addition to the city. This is what it'll look like. This is the extension of Front Street. Massive wide right-of-way with dedicated streetcar, huge rows of trees, massive wide sidewalk, and only one lane of traffic in each direction with a turning lane. Very important, because the public realm was more important here than anything else. And you can see the scale of buildings are generally mid-rise. This is another view looking from Corktown Common back towards the downtown core. Yes, there are some high-rise buildings at certain spots, but it's something that I think is going to prove very well. And those units now are for sale, and people are buying them now. They won't get to occupy them until after the Pan Am Games are over, but it's a big success story. Here's the other part of one of the precincts, the Lower Don Lands. We're actually rerouting the mouth of the Don River into a more naturalized pattern that it used to be, because it was cut off in what's called the Keating Channel there for years, that it silts up and you have to dredge it all the time. So this is quite inspiring as a new addition to the harbor. I showed this yesterday because I love it. This is now under construction. This will be done next summer. If you go there, this is Queens Quay along the waterfront. Again, narrowed the road from 4 lanes to 2, streetcar dedication, wide public realm for pedestrians. Going to be a great, great street. Here's something else we did, very sexy. Wave decks, right? You know, the wave motion, obviously. And we built these at the heads of all of the quays along the waterfront. And people love them. They swarm all over them all year round. And there was a big issue about, you can see that railing there, about, of course, the building code and people falling in and all that kind of stuff. But we solved that. But very important, this was sort of experimenting and pushing the envelope. But it's really helped. Gardner Expressway I talked about, we managed to get that Gardner East demolished and replaced with an at-grade wide boulevard. Some of you may know, there's a current debate after our municipal election next year about whether we take the Gardner down from roughly Jarvis Street over towards the Don Valley Parkway. The rest of it will stay up. But that piece is in really bad shape, and so there are studies ongoing about that. Another one I did was, I talked about yesterday, I opposed a Home Depot suburban big store on the waterfront. Fought it bitterly, won at council, won at the Ontario Municipal Board, only on principles. And the fact is, I wrote my evidence on the flight back from London with the chief planners over 3 scotches. So that's a great lesson for you. Sometimes that inspires you for great ideas. But, you know, my argument was real simple. I have nothing against Home Depot. It's a good company. We were approving a Home Depot in North York while I opposed it here. It's just you don't put stuff like that on the waterfront because there's only so much waterfront, okay? A couple more here. I talked about this. We prohibited all drive-throughs. Why? Because they suck up a lot of land, they threaten the stability of adjacent residential neighborhoods, and they're anti-urban, and you don't need them. You can have them in the pedestrian form on the main streets. You want to reinforce that pedestrian character, not break it up. So that proposal went through City Council, and it was appealed to the OMB. Lawyers under the sun came out and fought it because they had bank drive-throughs, fast food drive-throughs, cleaners, et cetera. Do you know, I'm sure you know, in the US you can go to a liquor store drive-through. Somebody told me in Nevada there's a funeral home drive-through. You can just, nice knowing you, and drive on. You know, I mean, basically, this all related to my belief in the publicness of the city, right? You don't want to suburbanize a good, healthy city fabric, and so we won that, and I'm proud of that. This is an ongoing fight. This is the Island Airport. Anybody here flown Porter Airlines? I'm sure. It's a good little airline for a 500-mile radius thing. But the current debate is they want to put jets in here and expand the runways and fly to LA and Vancouver and California and Florida and all over the place. These are the implications of doing that. Like, are we totally nuts, right? I mean, half the Inner Harbor is gone to accommodate Transport Canada's safety standards. As you know, it's on the water and extends way out into the lake, closes the Western Gap. All tour boats would be prohibitive from ever going through the Western Gap. It has huge landside and waterside implications. So this is an ongoing debate that'll come back next year when the new council is elected. Okay, now, does that ring a bell? Temporary insanity? Have you ever had moments like that as a planner or with your council or whatever? It happens. It's part of our job, but you got to figure out how to recover from that. And I had, and I'll highlight a couple of these things. I had, like you have, I'm sure, I had highlights in my career, but I had lowlights too. And some HR decisions were lowlights. I picked the wrong person. You know, it happens. You know, you best intentions and everything. I had to fire people. Not pleasant. But, you know, you got to have the right people who believe in where you want to go and you're part of the team and all those things. So they were problems. Main streets, you know, a lot of good stuff is happening now, but we still have tons of these suburban plazas as you do and every city in Canada does. I look at them as land resources because they're eventually going to get redeveloped. I had lunch with the president of Loblaw's development arm about a month ago, and she told me, Jane Marshall, her name is, she told me that they have a strategy to redevelop all of their suburban Loblaw's stores in old plazas because for mixed use, because it is a massive resource. And you're going to have a lot of that, I think, in our cities here in Alberta and all across the country. This is an example of a building that was proposed on Lower Ossington near Queen. 6 stories, great, love it. I support it, everybody supports it, but not the community. Why? Because it would destroy the neighborhood. It was foreign, it was too big, too tall, too everything. The story I told yesterday applied to this as well. What happens is, it eventually got approved and it sold out. And maybe, I would say to be fair, 75 to 80% of all the buyers were from the people who opposed it. Because they all of a sudden say, oh, I didn't think it'd be like this. This is good. I can sell my house, have money left over, still be in the neighborhood, walk, blah, 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 right? So there's this learning curve that I think you'll go through a lot more here, if you haven't already, with buildings like this. This is that Ataratiri area, the West Onlands, and while it was sitting fallow, that hurt to see it like that for so many years. But as I said, that's now finally changed. That's what it looks like almost today, almost built out. Another area of opportunity is in terms of the public housing sites. We have the Toronto Community Housing, enormous numbers of social housing, affordable housing sites all throughout the city. And many of them are on huge land areas. And there are opportunities to revitalize those particular buildings and those sites. So that's an agenda for us, and maybe it is for you. This is something I shared yesterday. It's a problem in most cities, but especially for us, the 3 Toronto scenario: rich downtown, shrinking middle class, growing poor. Not a good recipe for the future, because people want a piece of the pie, and you want to spread the investment and all the good news throughout the whole city. So Vital Science that comes out next week is going to be talking about that, as to what we do about that. This you can't read, but this is just simply revenue tools to support transit. This is the great debate of transit is not free. You have to figure out how to pay for it. And we've got 14 or 15 different tools here that are all controversial. There's nothing that is not controversial. But those debates we're having now, part of our election campaign, You may or may not have had them or will have more of them, who knows. But just my message here, the lesson is, again, nothing is free. You got to bite the bullet, and you have to stand up for what you believe in. That's the blow up on my last day of work.